Um, Welcome all. This is a talk about forestry programs in the Puget Sound region, and it's about how we are meeting an unmet need and finding out how to do that within the CD landscape. My name is Mark Mead, and this is...
I'm Margaret Creeder.
And we both work with through Mason Conservation District, and we also cover 3 other counties, which is Thurston, Kitsap, Pierce, and Mason. So the thing that we want to talk to you about today is making this thing work. Oh, there we go. Forestry is an unmet need in this region. In terms of when we talk about the needs, what we're talking about is work with the landowners. And so one of the things that we talk about today is we're going to be talking about how we went about setting up 2 programs to meet what was thought to be an unmet need, and how we went about proving that concept, how the goals we set, the kind of research that we went to behind it, the messaging that we developed to go out there, and then how we went about setting up the programs, and then delivering on those deliverables, and then we'll have a discussion about what we actually accomplished and the other steps forward.
Okay. So when we're talking about the need for forest planning, the people we're serving are the non-industrial private forest landowners or small forest landowners. And they are a significant portion of the forest land in Washington State. And with those lands, what we're really focused on is preventing the conversion of forests to other uses through either lack of knowledge, lack of someone to take over and manage, or any other issues. So trying to find out why lands are being converted and what we can do to prevent that if possible. So the 2 biggest threats or impediments to the forest stewardship management, active management on the lands, are lack of knowledge about the types of stewardship out there, what you can do. A lot of people think it's, either do nothing or clear cut it. And that's just not the case. There's a lot in between. And we can teach them about all those other options in between. One of the other big things is the cost of non-commercial activities. It's a pretty high barrier to entry. It takes a lot to get crews on the ground. Sometimes, the lands we're looking at are too small for most contractors to really want to take a look at. So there's a even higher investment needed to get them out there.
So as a solution, we're going to be talking about 2 programs, and I'll just say this up front today. We're not going to be talking about the actual dollars and cents that went into both of these programs, primarily because the 2 programs are fairly complex in the set of where those funding went. And one of the reasons for that is that we get the type of fundings that we got in the different programs, as well as who's getting money for doing what. So we're going to focus on what we did within the CD world within these 2 different programs. And the first one that we're going to talk about is called the Southwest. These are the actual titles. The Southwest Washington Small Forest Land Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And we will otherwise call that, we're going to be calling that the RCPP. Its lifespan is 2018 to 2023. So we're deep into the middle of it. We have 5 foresters that are working on it right now. McKenna down in Clark, Dave Hoke and Jim Gutcham, and they're covering Grays Harbor and Pacific. And then myself and Margaret will be funded. This particular batch of funding funds the Mason and Thurston County regions. One of the things to know about this particular funding is that it is funded through a joint through the NRCS, as well as the WDFW, Wildlife Fish, and the DNR. And the majority of our funding comes through the commission, Washington State Conservation Commission. And but there is additional funding that comes through in this really unique partnership, in the sense, because we'll talk about this later, as one of the deliverables, has to do with HFRPs, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, a little bit further on. The other program, which is a bigger one, and this is its actual title. It's had 2 iterations. It's actually gone through 2 program development slide. It went from one was funded through directly through King County, King Conservation District, and now it's being managed through Snohomish. And in that change, there's been a few changes, but the original title is Puget Sound Conservation District Caucus Regional Forest Stewardship Pilot Program. And we're going to refer to that as the PSC. This particular program was funded directly through funding for the Puget Sound National Estuary Program. And it's going through the Caucus, Puget Sound Caucus, if you're familiar with that, which is all of the districts within the region. We have in this one, not directly funded, partially funded, sort of funded, and totally funded people through this program in these different districts. So we have Kathy up in San Juan with Bruce, Nick Kuntz, who started with us or is up in Skagit, Stacy Dixon, who is actually managing this program for us in Snohomish and Whidbey Island, Ellen Arnstein, who's over at King Conservation District, and then there's Margaret, myself, and Mason Kitsap, Thurston, and Pierce. This particular program has uniqueness in the sense that it actually titles it right at the very beginning, which is what we're going to talk about today a little bit more, is it's a pilot program. And so it's a proof program.
Okay, so there's 2 kind of overlapping but slightly different goal sets for each of these programs. So for the Southwest, it's kind of Southwest RCPP. It's looking a little bit more at larger landscapes, looking at committing to longer term stewardship. A lot of this is focused on getting people into EQIP and CSP, which are those 2 NRCS programs. If you're not familiar, EQIP is Environmental Quality Incentive Program. CSP is Conservation Stewardship Program. So part of that is so increasing the number of acres that are being actively managed through those 2 kind of funding sources, increasing the number of small forest lands with active forest plans that are being followed for that management, and like I said before, increasing that implementation that's following those management plans. It's also trying to prove the point that there is a need for consistent forest technical assistance out there. You know, even people who have been managing their forests for years and years still like to have people come in. They like that knowledge sharing. They want to know what everyone else is doing. They want to know what the new science says to do. So, you know, there's those people that are still asking questions, even though they've had experience managing their forests. And then lastly is the implementation of conservation easement. Like Mark mentioned before, there's the HFRP program, which is the Healthy Forest Reserve Program. And that's through another program through NRCS. And that's kind of a special program. It can only really take place through an RCPP. And otherwise, you know, that opportunity isn't available just to anyone to apply for regularly through NRCS. And then for the PSC, the goals were a little bit more broad because we had more of a regional approach to this. We are covering a large area of Puget Sound, so they're a little more qualitative in general about you know, building that relationship and creating the pilot project, proving the need for that forest assistance broadly throughout the region. That's kind of been lacking in the last several years. And then providing some increase in educational opportunities for people, doing workshops. And then in general, we talked about that prevention of conversion. So that was kind of a big one. This PSC program follows the Puget Sound Partnership Plan, and the prevention of conversion out of forest land was identified as one of the key components to increasing salmon habitat or improving that habitat. So in general, it's just the PSC program was designed to prove the need and then follow through on helping people that have that need.
Okay, so when we look at this in terms of, the actual things that we're going to do, the objectives, the goals that were accomplished out there, the deliveries in the field, and as we mentioned earlier, is that this Healthy Forest Reserves program, this is a new program in the state. So this is one of the first programs put into the state. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the program, but the objective was to get out into all eight counties that we're working on to provide technical assistance. How many of you are all familiar with all the acronyms, TA, RA, all the CSP, EQIP, all that stuff? So we don't have to say them all out. Great. And then provide conservation planning. Once again, a lot of things that Margaret was talking about earlier. And then also going out there in that Southwest RCPP, their direct focus was on getting those funding that we had through the EQIP, and we had actually dedicated funding, about $300,000 for EQIP funding through the RCPP, and that basically got eaten up in the first round that we went through for that direct funding. The CSP program actually expanded considerably, and we have about $2 million in that pocket. Unfortunately, if you're familiar with the CSP program, it has some hiccups to it. The same is true with the HFRP program. When we look at the task within the PSC program, very specific to what we're doing in terms of program development. These tasks were actually literally written out. And so we're looking at project development, the overall management of the program, how the management is going to be doing the deliverables. These are all funded, which is usually something that's you don't see it so much in these type of programs. They don't fund the management side of it. And then we looked at the delivery of the forest stewardship and also the outreach. And then when you'll see embedded in that outreach is some of the things we're talking about, including things like a marketing and engagement strategy and how we went out about focusing on getting that done. And then we're looking at the forest health management. And then one of the really cool things, which we're not there yet, we'll be talking about at the end of this year, is how we went about communicating this need and also communicating the outcomes from the program. Now, the big deliverable for us, the foresters on the ground out there, were written out in these particular programs, and these are the kind of the things that we're focusing on. And so for the PSC program, we want to get out and talk to at least 125 landowners on about anywhere from 600 to 2,400 acres. And then we want to be able to support getting 25 of those people into a landowner, into enrollment into some form of open space taxation program. And then we want to look at getting 36 landowners secure the cost funding. You'll see the two different numbers, and that's because that program change we talked about that shifted down, because we actually had been in progress for about 6 to 8 months, and then we decided then it went from King to Snohomish, and that contract was renegotiated. In the Southwest RCP, you'll see it's a little bit more focused in terms of delivery on those FMPs. 200 was the goal set that we looked at, and then implementation of the CSP and EQIP on 4,000 acres and 7,000 acres respectively. And then once again, as I said earlier, you'll see that this combination of, for the HFRP, was a partnership between WDFW, the DNR, and the CD world, as well as NRCS. And goal was 1 to 2 of these contracts, getting the HFRPs in there.
All right, so to start out the process of both of these grants, we wanted to take a look at, what was already out there, what do people see as a need, and how do we prioritize that within our landscape? So we did kind of an informal survey to kind of gather some responses from people in our region. These were mostly professionals that were on the ground, maybe some knowledgeable community members that, had a background in forestry or had been in the area for a while, enough to see, what was going on. So we got their feedback on, what they saw as a need. We put together a list of these general topics. So the highest rated one was definitely the development, which was one of the biggest goals of the program, was the prevention of conversion. So seeing this really proved the need that we did need to be out there and helping with that issue. And so we asked that question kind of two different ways. We did, so you'll see there the conversion rates there and the development rates there. We asked about resource concerns, and then we also asked about social concerns. So that was identified in both categories as a kind of a two-pronged problem. So that kind of requires a different solution for both sides of those. So, why was it happening as a resource concern, and maybe what the social side was bringing to the table as far as that. There was also a great need called out for forest planning. So that's exactly what we were there to provide. So it's great to see that, that need was there, that we could then come in and meet. You'll see a couple more up there. So noxious weeds, so definitely one that people were concerned about. Stand composition as far as, the ages and size of the trees, the density out there. That has a lot to do with climate resilience too. If you have a lot of young, dense stands, they're already stressed, they're going to be more vulnerable. And then a lot of issues can come down the line from that. So a lot of kind of unmanaged areas that people maybe didn't know what to do with because they didn't have a plan in place. They didn't have the resources to get someone out there to take a look. So having us out there to offer that service was a big need. So from that, we kind of went through the two different programs based on what those outlines were, what the goals were for each side of the program. We came up with some priority land areas to look at for each of those. So the PSC was basically 1 acre to 60 acres. So very small landowners to, small to medium almost, trying to look at where they fit on the landscape, how we could help them and providing them those services. We didn't have any direct funding for implementation here. This was all technical assistance and planning work. So it was really, using what we had available. So a lot of the NRCS programs, directing people towards those or other opportunities that were available for any type of funding. Some of these smaller, very small lands, there's not a lot of programs out there to help with their concerns and doing that management. It's also important to note for the PSC, kind of the base model for that was the King CD and King County Forest approach. They have a program that does do very small lots of land. So that was kind of a starting point, and seeing what that need was for that kind of a program all over the board. And so we definitely do get a lot of calls on very small areas, and so that was definitely a need that we saw. So the other one was small urban interface lands, especially with increased impacts from urban development, and then also the risk of the development within that urban interface is going to be a lot higher, especially if you have a really small parcel. People don't think it's worth it to keep a forest on there. They're just going to go ahead and continue developing out. But we know that those are really important for, maintaining some kind of a natural presence in the area, all the ecosystem services those forests provide, the wildlife corridors in and out of these areas. And then also for when we're thinking about fire, there's another enacting management within these areas that could pose a risk to homes in the interface area. And then also one of those goals was the salmon streams as I said before, it was based on the Puget Sound Partnership salmon recovery planning. So identifying areas that were salmon streams and, riparian forests, and improving those areas was important. For the Southwest RCPP, it was pretty much anything above 5 acres. That's the limit in Washington for, or at least in our area, for the designated forest land tax designation. So you have to have 5 acres of forest in order to be within that tax zone as a working forest, or recognized as a working forest by the state. And then, so there was some funding through EQIP and CSP. There were kind of separate pools set aside for the RCPP to use. So it was a little bit easier for them to kind of get those fundings. So it was a little more, they didn't have to compete with everyone all across the board, just within the RCPP. And then lastly was the HFRP easement. So we introduced that before. Specifically, it targeted marble murrelet habitat. So we learned a lot about marble murrelets through the process, and what they need. It's a very specific forest type. So there were not a lot of people, jumping at that chance, but we did get actually a pretty good bunch who applied, and were excited about that opportunity. Okay, so I think I kind of went through a lot of that.
Pretty much.
Yep. Okay. Keep going. I guess one other point is that, a lot of people within the smaller areas of land that, maybe weren't familiar with how to manage their forest land, didn't understand that there are those kind of tax exemptions, which can be really beneficial for them as far as keeping forest land. Paying that high residential tax value on a larger lot is pretty expensive over time, and that could drive people to sell or convert to make up that difference. So that was another thing where we kind of wanted to tap into those people who didn't know about that option, get them a forest plan and get them into that program that could be highly beneficial. Okay.
Okay. So one of the things that came out of our program, especially with the work that we're doing in the PSC, was that we are working across a number of different districts. And so you'll see here the different methodologies that we approached. And one of the things about conservation districts, if nothing, they're not uniform in application and how they go about attaching. We're looking at things, but we did look at different types of categories of things, and we looked at it in different ways. So as an example, when you look up at Island County, the acreage areas that they're looking at is fairly significant, 5 to 200 acres. You look at King, it's 1 to 5. And you look at us down in Mason, we're looking at 5 to 120. And then, so those acreages went up and down. Skagit less than 40. So the other thing that we looked at is we took a different approach in terms of how we looked at those tax status, because tax status was a fairly significant component of the work that we're doing. And it's really important, especially like when I was first getting rolling in Mason, was for people coming to us for a plan to meet tax needs, to meet a legitimate concern that they had. And so we did it 2 different ways. One was we looked at it as the designated forest lands, and then we looked at it as the undesignated forest lands. Okay, and so in 2 different categories. Then we looked at, and then another thing is that we looked at what type of land cover, how are we going to know if it's forested? So we looked at a couple of different methodologies for looking at how, as you see, we've got a national land cover database. A lot of us use that. In Mason, we are very fortunate. We had the 2019 LIDAR data that we were able to derive canopy from. And so we use that as a methodology for identifying if it's forested or not. There's the WDF land cover that's being used. And then there's some global forest changes, what's being used up north. Something that came out, and this is something we'll talk a little bit about later, is the Forest Action Plan with the DNR that came out right about the time that we were developing this particular 2 different grants. And so we used that, and it did feed back into, as Margaret mentioned earlier, it feed back into our prioritization set in the action goals and objectives. And then we also looked at the location of these lands in proximity to streams and shorelines that are identified through the WDFW or other programs. Some other concerns were being brought up. In King, as we mentioned earlier, King Conservation District has a fairly well-developed forestry program. So they're already looking at a whole bunch of different types of things in their programming. And they've fully evolved it and looking at things like a degraded watershed, fire-wise, other things that are being mapped out. So as you can see, very robust scattergun approach to how we go about prioritizing landscape. Interestingly enough, the landscapes in terms of the amount of land that we're talking about vary considerably, but the number of parcels, and that's what this number represents, the number of parcels that we identified for outreach to was about 18,000 total. And that's 18,000 across the region. So you'll notice it's fairly consistent in terms of the numbers of parcels. And I don't know if any of you were here yesterday listening to some of the talks that were given about how the landscape is changing out there in ownership and in our state, and that landscape is becoming more owners of less land, of the same amount of land in forest. So that land is being partialized. So we see that in that total number of lands out there. So
Okay.
so we'll hand this off to Margaret. So this,
Okay. So 2 things we used in our development of the prioritization were the TELI document, the tools for engaging landowners effectively, and then the National Woodland Owners Survey. And then those 2 kind of started off the program. They were identified within the PSC documentation as 2 things that kind of outlined what we were planning on doing, you know, what the goals were. The tools for engaging landowners effectively was a great one that kind of split up different drivers for people who own forest land, and I think we'll get to that later. And then as far as the Washington Small Forest Landowners study that was done in 2020, that we used a little more, you know, after it was published after the program started, but we used it a lot to develop our marketing toolkit. And that was another one that kind of went into that, the purpose for people owning land, you know, what their individual goals were, and how we could maybe reach them by sparking that interest in goals, and how the management tools that we were providing could help them reach that.
I threw this one in here for fun because there's a formula. This is actually some work that was done in Finland about the same non-industrial private forest landowners. And what's interesting to us is that very similar outcomes in terms of ownership and change in ownership going on on a global level. So it was kind of fun in the sense, and I really just threw that in there because it had a formula. But so when we look at speaking to these priority landowners, one of the things that we finally sussed this down into is that it's boiling it down is to non-commercial landowners and commercial landowners. Commercial landowners, of course, are managing their lands for economic purposes. Those are usually the people with much larger lands, and they have a definite need for the information and help with managing that forest towards a commercial outcome. But one of the other ones, the other side of this equation, especially in these smaller lands, is the non-commercial landowners, and they're purchasing primarily because of the ecological needs or ecological purposes. And they're looking for a piece of land that they can own that essentially is going to be a park for them. So they're going to be a forest steward. One of the things that we talked about is these landowners are the ones that are purchasing a piece of land because they like the idea of owning a piece of land that's forested, but they don't necessarily have education and background or the information that they need to adequately manage that land. And so the purpose of this is that there's more of these folks out there. And these are the folks that we want to get to, and these people that we want to talk to. So when we looked at that, one of the things that we did was develop some marketing tools. And one of these marketing tools, through a lot of great work out of Snohomish, was develop this marketing toolkit. Basically, it's how do you market for foresters? And a lot of good things came out of that. Consistent messaging, and we're looking at putting it into a format that we could use easily. As a matter of fact, all the graphics from this particular document come from that set of graphics. And then the reason that we say that is because it makes it easy for us to go to the same place and to have a look that's consistent across all of this disparate area that we're working in. And also, we wanted to develop messaging that was consistent with that research that we talked about earlier. So connected look once again. And so this connected message, and you'll notice that there's a strong similarity in the look of these two things, but the messaging is completely different. The first one is talking about how you take care of that real estate in terms of its need for designated forest land, the economic drivers that you're going to have to it, why it's important to keep it in designated forest lands. And if you're not familiar with the designated forest land taxation process, it is a kind of a de facto conservation program. When your land is in designated forest land, there is an economic driver to keep it in forest land because the conversion to another tax form requires 10-year payback on that tax difference. And that tax difference can be anywhere from 20 to 50 to 100% difference in your current taxation on those programs. And the other one we're looking at, stewarding your forest, is about those folks that are buying that land to take care of it for their ecological purposes, that they would like to have wildlife, just having trees around, the messaging that we're saying. So you'll see that these messages look very similar. Graphics are very similar, but the messaging is a tad bit different, and it's talking to the forest landowners. This is kind of a fun thing that we came up with, which is a forest-friendly calendar. We had a little bit of discussion about how this goes together in terms of what your practices are through the fall, winter, and spring and summer, and what you're going to be doing during those period of time. And one of the things that we did discuss was that a lot of the stuff that we do, except for say planting and some of the harvest in deep areas, can be pretty much done throughout the year. But one of the things that we want to do is just create an easy to use graphic that we could demonstrate the need, and also to get people an understanding that you can be doing these practices, and this is how you want to schedule out your year in terms of taking care of it. And also, the other thing that we're looking for is to develop a graphic that was eye-grabbing and gets people interested, and we could produce and get out the door fairly easily.
So we got all that messaging together, and now we needed to get the message out to people. So we did that a couple of different ways. There was the direct outreach via the postcards you saw earlier. There was talking to the county tax assessors to tell them, we are a service that's available. They send out notes when people need to renew their tax status and have a new forest plan submitted so that they can stay in the program. And that's a pretty significant tally against them if they don't get that in. They're converting their land base back to a different tax code, and then they have to pay back taxes. So it's a pretty big incentive to renew that forest plan. So we got a lot of people reached out because of that connection with the assessors and letting them know, we have this service available. We can help people continue their designation. The other one was word of mouth. We talked to, people who are already in the community, let them know, we have this program available now, spread the word. There was also social media. So we had all those great graphics put together. We had a set of Facebook and Instagram photos put together that were just kind of educational tidbits that then could tie back to, the need for stewardship and that we provided that service. And then we also got referrals from the WSU coach planning course. A lot of people who go through that, maybe want someone to double check their work, just want some on the ground face-to-face time. So we got to go out there with them, help them finish out their plan, and let them know, there are some next steps you can do, where that funding could be that they could use to implement any practices they wanted to do, as well as our CD peers. So we cover 4 counties. So we relied a lot on some of the farm planners and the other CD employees to kind of, they had people that had questions about forestry. They knew people who already had forest land and, could send them towards us to, outreach to them and, provide that technical assistance that hadn't been there before. And so it didn't take very long to get the message out. We're pretty much getting calls in within the first month, and it hasn't really stopped since then. So one of the ways we use to intake these, we use an online form, basically goes through all the different kinds of questions, what resources are on the property. And we would send that to them after we got the initial phone call conversation saying, what do you want to do? Do you have this kind of situation going on? And, if it sounded like something that was within our program goals. And, for the most part, it pretty much always was. So we would send them out this questionnaire, talk through them. It led them through kind of thinking about their goals for the property. A lot of people don't consider what they want. They're often asking us, oh, what do you recommend? And it's like, well, it always is going to vary on, what you want to do. We could recommend a lot of things, but, if it's not something that they're interested in or that's part of their goals overall, they're not going to do it. So we want to kind of tease that out of them. Think about the resources on the property. We ask about, do you have water? Do you have, do you know anything about your forest health? Do you see dying trees? Do you see certain things here and there? Do you know anything about your soils? Do you have just general questions? If they had, they could sit down, think of any questions they had. Tell us anything about the property history. Some people know a lot. Some people have had this land for a while and they can tell you a lot about it. They could tell you about the people who owned it before, and some people really don't know anything. So it's kind of a good question to ask because, you can get a variety of answers. And so we also use this when writing the plan. It's a good thing to reference back to. You can kind of have that list of goals in mind while you're writing, and use that to the full advantage for assisting with that.
So one thing to remember, this is an online form, and it's easy to send out as an email to get people to do that. And also gave Margaret to develop her smart sheet skills.
Okay. And yeah, so then after we got that form from them, we got kind of that background information. We usually put together a packet, maps, things that would be interesting. Questions? 5 minutes. Okay. All right. And then we would go out for a site visit. We take a look around, usually with the landowner, see what's out there, see if there's anything we notice that's not on the form they sent us. And then also a lot of those visits, we visit with some of the farm planners who maybe already had connections with them, or other CD staff, riparian planners as well. Get some more information from them on their goals. So then we'd go back, develop a plan for those people who wanted it. It's a pretty comprehensive document. But it's really more of a working document. It's a guide for the land. It can change as they go. If they realize a new goal in mind, they can adapt the plan to suit that. And we really want to make something that's customized so that they will follow through and have a reason to be following that plan.
I'm going to push.
Okay.
So how many of you are familiar with the template, forest management template, forest management plan? This template actually goes through, serves the needs, these different needs. So it works for CAP, which is now a CPA, in timber management plan for the different agencies. And so it's really important. And we settle on that would be our standard template. And we can run through this real quick. I wanted to get to the deliverables real quick because if you know anything about a forest management plan, it does all the standard stuff. One of the things that we're looking at in terms of this particular document is focusing on carbon sequestration, management plans, and conservation planning in doing that inventory. If you're familiar with the conservation world, you know that there's a number of different funding sources out there that are available. EQIP, the CSP, through the DNR, there's the PrEP program, there's the urban forestry programs, forest legacy program, a number of different programs are out there. King Conservation District, as we mentioned earlier, has a 75% reimbursement program for there are things that are out there for the folks. And once again, going back into the EQIP program in the CSP program, we have some cost share programs that are out there, and we're try to incentivize people into getting into those by working with them on it. But what I wanted to get to real quick is what we've delivered on to date. Now, these two programs are still in process. And I'm going back to those things that we looked at, combined goals of 120 site visits, 2,400 acres, 225 forest plans, 4,000 acres, financial assistance to 12 property owners across 1,200 acres. You can see the numbers up here. I look at it in terms, I'm a metric kind of guy, and that's what I do is looking at delivering on those metrics. And so to date, we've gotten out across all the two different programs, 1,000 folks, landowners, covering about 35,000 acres. We developed 226 plans across this area, 8,600 acres. And we delivered on 13 financial assistance programs on 749 acres. Now, those two numbers represent that those last numbers are the thing that we're going to talk about real quick at the end, the difficulties we've seen. But you can also see that if you look at this, we've delivered on 1,400% of what we're looking at for these goals and 866% on the goals for getting out and doing site visits. And we're already at and met our goal for doing plans. So we have some, and we still have about 8 months in one program and another year in the other program. We've also gone out and done a number of different coach planning courses through WSU, delivered on a number of different programs. Margaret and myself, through some pushing from our friends at Pierce Conservation District, delivered on 4 seminars and coach forest field day. We also had a wildfire open house. So we're delivering on those development and going out there through these programs. It's been very successful in terms of what we've been able to get out there. And going back to the proof of concept, this is something that's really important to understand. To date, right now, we have about, between the two programs, we've got about 80 people on the waiting list across the two districts. This is really important. Margaret and I are pushed out to about 2 months, 3 months out from the plans that are coming in. We're getting a steady stream coming in. So there is a need out there. So we definitely feel like we have met the goals and accomplished what we're trying to do. And we do have a message. Going back, the lessons learned. Easiest thing for us to do is get out there and talk to people, develop those plans once we talk to them. The education events, I say push this, but it was actually fairly simple because the folks that do this stuff, and we can rely on that. The outreach plan was really cool. It was a lot of fun to develop that outreach plan. We got a lot of graphics out of it. Hardest thing for us to do, and you all know this if you're in the CD world, is implementing these programs and implementing these plans. That's the hardest thing to get done. And then we have this unicorn. We were this close, literally this close to closing in on that HFRP deal. We had a minor hiccup on some of the funding stuff. And then unfortunately the landowner passed. And so that made it really incredibly difficult for us to do it. And that particular property, just by happenstance, had been identified some 15 years earlier as HFRP habitat. So we were that close to accomplishing that goal. The CSP, like I mentioned earlier, one of our biggest problems with the CSP is that the TA for that is only about $7,000 for us to do the work. And then they have about $2 million in the program. And if you look at it, CSP, it's about $1,500 to $2,000 to $3,000 sort of max for a CSP. So if you look at that in terms of, if you do the math, even if it's at $5,000 per property, that means we've got to get out and talk to about 200 people in this program to eat that money up. We don't have the time to do that. So
all right, well, I know we're out of time, so we'll just go through this real quick. You can leave if you want. So, you know, the next steps is we obviously need to continue to outreach and to connect with the landowners. We've definitely proved that there's a need out there for this kind of work, and you know, we want to continue delivering this kind of work. We're going to need to connect with the broader forest community. You know, that's where a lot of that CSP implementation is going to be. Those are the more experienced landowners who are going to have properties and that qualify for that kind of programming. So connecting with them is important to help get them into those types of programs that can really benefit them and increase that long-term management. And then looking at removing barriers to implementation, especially around kind of some of those stressors that it takes to get some of the funding, you know, looking at getting some direct implementation funding for ourselves so we can more efficiently kind of get that out on the ground and do that a little more quickly, as well as increasing the CD capacity for producing these forest plans and providing that assistance. And that requires continued funding. So we're always looking for the next source of funding for us, for foresters. You know, we are funded, our grants are the only thing that funds our positions. And so we're always going to be looking for more to try and make that program sustainable.
And going on that, one of the things that's really important to understand with the number of districts that we're working with, some of the districts have funding in their individual CDs to help out, and that this funding was supplement to that. And then, like ourselves, we're directly funded through these grants. Question?
Any idea why Clallam and Jefferson CDs were not included in this?
No idea whatsoever. No, actually, honestly, I don't.
Okay.
They were intended to be in there, and I think the biggest issue had to do with the availability of them to be able to step forward and fund these programs. Because if you look at and this is one of the things I wanted to avoid talking about, is the complexity of how these are funded is really who's getting paid to do what, where, is very unique, and it's almost unique to each district. And so yes, Stacy.
Thanks for the great summary. All this awesome work. I just also wanted to throw out somebody new or maybe you already said, but I could work Proctor for the Summer-ish did all this graphics. That's virtual calendar. So any graphics for she's in person.
Yeah, that's the Snohomish CD really stepped up. Other programs, Pure CD stepped up, and it's been real fun to do this program. Any questions? No, thank you.
Cut it.
Okay, you're out of here.
Thanks, Dave.